Did you know that France ruled Chad for almost 120 years? It wasn't officially, of course. But with the help of its military, France was able to maintain control over Chad and its leaders. This is why it came as a shock to everyone that at a time when the other countries in the Sahel turned their backs on France, Chad, France's strongest ally in the Sahel, decided to kick France out. It was a huge blow to France and President Macron. However, not only did Chad celebrate the departure of French troops, the president of Chad recently made shocking revelations about France's presence in the country. So, what did he reveal? Let's find out. January 31st, 2025 was a historic day for Chad. On this day, France lowered their flag from their base in Chad, officially marking the end of its military presence in the country. According to the reports, the troops had been in Chad for the past 70 years. French troops officially arrived in N'Djamena, Chad's capital, to train the country's young military during independence in 1960. However, France decided to stay, claiming France wanted to support Chad's air force against rebels. It stationed troops in N'Djamena, claiming it was helping Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger to fight militant groups and terrorists operating within Sahel states. But what went on over the next decades had absolutely nothing to do with fighting militant groups. Analysts of France's relationship with Chad have pointed out that France's presence has more to do with maintaining a sense of control rather than combating insecurity. In our opinion, this is the truth. The French military has been in Chad for over 70 years with its superior intelligence and power. This means that the French military was there when the insurgency first started. They were there when the jihadist group in small numbers began to wreak havoc with their limited weapons and intelligence. The question is, if France was truly there to fight insecurity, why couldn't France have stopped the insurgency at its earliest stage? Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. Under the eyes of the French military, insurgency groups spread across the Sahel. Under their eyes, the groups increased their attacks. Under their eyes, the group grew to have access to gold mines in the Sahel, which they used to fund their operations. The insecurity in the Sahel has led to the deaths of thousands of people and a humanitarian crisis, leading to the displacement of millions of innocent citizens. One such deadly attack occurred in 2015 when insurgents launched an attack in the capital of Chad, N'Djamena. The attack led to the death of 40 people and wounded over 100 people. But what is very surprising about the incident is the fact that the attack occurred a few kilometers from the French military base. The question is, how did the French forces not know about the attack? But that's not all. In 2019, Islamic militants carried out another deadly attack in Boma, Lac province, killing about 100 Chadian soldiers. At the time, it was one of the deadliest attacks to have ever occurred in Chad's history. It was from this time that the people began to question the presence of French forces in the country. France continued to expand its military across the Sahel and even beyond, but their impact in eliminating the insecurity was never felt. The worst part was that France was there initially to help train the Chadian soldiers. However, despite the length of time France had in the country, the Chadian military remained unequipped and depended largely on France for security efforts. But even though many were not happy with the presence of the French military, France continued to remain in the country. The reason for this lies in Chad's leadership. Since independence, Chad has been a privileged arena for French military interventions and acts as a barometer of French commitment to its African clients. All of this is thanks to its ruler. For instance, in the 1960s and 70s, France intervened in support of Chadian government forces that were battling against the Frelonat. In 1982, Hissène Habré came to power with French support. When the late Chad president, Idriss Déby, orchestrated a coup to overthrow Habré and take over power, France did not interfere. In fact, France supported him and continued to support him for 38 years until his death. Isn't this hypocritical of France? This same France that supported a coup turned around to condemn the coup in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Now, some people might say that perhaps that is the old French leadership. Well, they are wrong. In 2021, Chad's former president, Idriss Déby, was killed in the battlefront from rebels shelling. After his death, President Macron himself was responsible for helping his son, who is now the current president of Chad, to take over power through a military coup. But he was not just responsible for the coup in secret. Macron endorsed it publicly, claiming that the military takeover was necessary for security reasons. Macron ignored the voice of the people and supported the current president's transition to power. This was because Macron needed to maintain French influence and military bases in the country. Perhaps if he had known that 3 years later, the same president that he supported would turn back against him, he wouldn't have supported him. Contrary to what Western media will tell you, it was from this time that anti-French sentiments began to stir and spread in Chad. France clearly proved how double-standard it was when it supported Chad's coup and condemned the coup in Mali, which happened in the same period. Now, after the coups happened in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso and French forces were kicked out, Chad became very important to France. This expulsion of French troops made Chad the last country in the region to host French troops, and thus increased its importance because French deployment in Chad has helped to project France's military power in the Sahel and also paint the image that France was a leading actor in the continent. However, for some reason, the current president of Chad decided to behave differently from his father. Whereas his father was a staunch ally of France, President Mahamat decided that he would not be. This showed in early 2022 when France insisted that President Déby exclude himself from running for president and appoint Succès Masra as prime minister. However, Déby refused, and there was nothing France could do about it because there was the threat of Chad kicking French forces out of the country, and that is something that France wanted to avoid at all costs. In addition, Chad's strategic importance to France currently means that if France wants to stay in Chad, it will have to support Chad no matter what. Perhaps the reason why the president decided to turn his back on France was because of the growing demand not just among Chad citizens, but also among Chad political elites for French troops to withdraw completely from the country. A coalition of activists, including the Wakatama movement, announced that it would begin staging protests if France did not start withdrawing its troops by the end of 2023. These activists and political elites point out France's double standards in backing an unconstitutional takeover by the president after his father's death, and how in 2019, France released deadly airstrikes on rebels. Meanwhile, their purpose in Chad was supposedly to fight terrorists. So the Chadian president did not only begin to build new diplomatic relations with Russia, but a few months later, he ended the defense agreement with France. And France never envisioned this. Macron never thought that a day like that would come. But it did, and it was greatly celebrated by the people of Chad. Speaking on the issue, a 26-year-old teacher, Balkang Jajin, spoke to VOA via a messaging app from N'Djamena. He said he was delighted to see French troops leaving. He said he does not understand why it took a long time for Chad's government officials to order French troops out. He says French troops were only useful in Chad from June 1983 to December 1984, when France sent close to 4,000 troops to stop an invasion by the Libyan military and Chad rebels. However, some Western analysts have said that the departure of French troops from Chad would put the country in jeopardy in terms of its security efforts. They said that the recent attack from Boko Haram following the departure of French troops from Chad was a result of the absence of French troops in the country. But that is ridiculous. Boko Haram launched several attacks while French troops were still in the country. So, what difference does it make with their absence? This was the same narrative given to Burkina Faso when French troops first left the country. However, just like Traore, the president of Chad, Mahamat Déby, has stated that Chad is ready to strengthen its military force without the help of France. He said that Chad's military is ready to protect the country from any destabilization attempt. But here is where it gets interesting. The Chadian president revealed that France has long dominated the country's oil industry. Chad is blessed with abundant oil resources, yet like other African countries, the citizens have not been able to benefit from it. The exploitation of oil, mostly by French oil companies such as Total Energies, has destroyed the local farmers' production system, depriving them of their living. It is polluting the water, soil, and air. It is dividing the people and sowing despair, especially among the young. From 2004 to 2011, The state's budget increased from at least 300 billion CFA to more than 1,572 trillion CFA, but the advantages of this manna are not benefiting the people. Neither the conditions of life of the 11 million Chadians nor the public services have improved. The promises made by companies and by the government have not been kept, and the World Bank left the country in 2008. Chad's oil exploitation, financed by the World Bank, has been controversial since the planning stages and is even more so now that it is in operation. Opponents foresaw that, with Chad being one of the 5 most corrupt countries in the world, the people were not going to benefit from the income oil would bring in. It would only suffer its downsides. Those who favored the scheme put their trust in the promises of the government, the operating company, and the World Bank, who all affirmed that oil would be the answer to the country's poverty. To receive World Bank finance for the project, the government committed itself to allocating 70% of the income from oil to the reduction of poverty. 5% was for developing the southern part of the country. The World Bank claimed the Chad Oil Project was to be a model of how natural resources could help eradicate poverty and benefit the population. However, none of these promises have been realized. All of this is thanks to the companies and the corrupt government. Hopefully, President Deby will make better decisions than his predecessors. But did you know that African countries funded elections in France? Many people are not aware of this, given the fact that 1. African countries are regarded by France and the West as the poorest countries in the world, and 2. African countries have been receiving developmental aid from France since independence. In fact, this financial aid constitutes a large part of their budget. However, this shocking secret was revealed by a trusted aide of 2 former French presidents, Robert Bourgi, in his book, They Know That I Know It All, My Life in Francafrique. The question is, how and why did African leaders fund French elections? Well, Francophone Africa got their independence. The French government was already financing and building France with proceeds from its colonies. However, France was determined to maintain access to its colonies even when they demanded independence. This is how Francafrique was born. Francafrique is the system created by the French leader, Charles de Gaulle. This system was a deal made between de Gaulle and African leaders in exchange for their independence. It involved granting France exclusive access to their raw materials, which means allowing French companies such as Orano and Elf Aquitaine exclusive right to exploit their resources, and in exchange, France would grant them independence as well as protect the leaders against democracy or coup d'etat and international criticism. France did this to restore its status in the globe after losing it in World War II. So, with an independent supply of oil and uranium from its former colonies, France was able to rebuild and regain its status in the globe. Now, you would think that with all this wealth, France would be wealthy enough to fund its election, right? But that's not what happened according to Robert Bourgi. Robert Bourgi was born in 1945 in Senegal and rose to become a confidant of a generation of African leaders. From Omar Bongo in Gabon to Denis Sassou Nguesso of Congo-Brazzaville, late President Deby in Chad, and Blaise Compaoré of Burkina Faso. He also inherited the mantle of Jacques Foccart, the French leader who took over Charles de Gaulle and ensured that Francafrique was kept alive till today. In France, Bourgi became a trusted aide of Jacques Chirac and later on former President Nicolas Sarkozy. Now age 79, Bourgi, who was at the center of it all, decided to reveal all that happened during his time in politics in his book. His book revealed so many things regarding France's influence in African politics and vice versa, but one of the shocking revelations is how French elections were funded by African leaders. According to Bourgi, this system whereby Francophone Africa was a source of financing for all French political parties was already an established system before he came on the scene in the 1980s. In fact, when he entered the scene, it was already a normal thing. Bourgi revealed that the former president of France, Jacques Chirac, received almost $10 million each for the 2 presidential elections he won in 1995 and 2002. In fact, he said that Chirac was the biggest beneficiary of African cash, especially from the late president of Gabon, Omar Bongo. Bourgi went on to explain that whenever an election was approaching in France, President Chirac would send him to deliver a message to several African leaders. Then, the African leaders would respond by sending a representative to Bourgie in Paris with several millions of dollars or CFA francs. Bourgie in turn would be the one to carry it through the underground corridors of the Paris presidential palace to give President Chirac. According to Bourgie, the money was mostly placed in briefcases, but sometimes they were carried in African drums and sports bags. In his interview detailing the story, Bourgie revealed that during the 2002 Paris election, a representative of the Burkina Faso president Blaise Compaoré arrived in Paris with a large sum of money hidden in African djembe drums. According to Bourgie, he accompanied the envoy to the Élysée Palace, where they were greeted by Chirac. Then, they opened the sealed drums using a pair of scissors, and loads of banknotes fell out. Both parties, including France and the corrupt African leaders, ensured the system worked and was kept secret. The question is, why did Bourgie decide to spill the beans? Well, it would interest you to know that Bourgie didn't start spilling the secret recently. No, he first did so in 2011. And he spilled it all because the president of Gabon, Omar Bongo, whom Bourgie was very close to, told him to reveal all the secrets after he died. Apparently, at the time, French President Chirac and President Omar were having some issues. So, 2 years after Omar died, Bourgie decided to honor his words and reveal the secret of how African leaders funded Paris elections. When the news came out, officials both from African countries involved and Paris denied the allegations, although a former presidential advisor in Ivory Coast conceded they were historical practice. However, an investigation was launched, but guess what? It was dropped on the basis that the payments were long ago. But isn't that corruption? African leaders are regarded as among the most corrupt leaders in the world, but political leaders in France and the West are the worst because they present this facade of being good. France was content with Africa funding its elections. Meanwhile, citizens of these countries were suffering under the leadership of these corrupt African leaders. Think about it. To make matters worse, all the African leaders involved, from Omar Bongo in Gabon to Denis Sassou Nguesso of Congo-Brazzaville and Blaise Compaoré of Burkina Faso, have a common trait. They ruled for a very long time and yet were hailed as proponents of democracy by France. But it shouldn't be surprising because that was the agreement made between Charles de Gaulle and Francophone leaders. According to de Gaulle, France would shield these African leaders from international criticisms regardless of how they ruled as long as they give France access to their minerals. Both parties kept their words and created a system that enriched African leaders and gave France exclusive access to these countries' resources. However, the leaders of the Sahel and members of the AES have started a new trend. They have started on a path to break free from the chains and influence of France. Hopefully for Chad, it will not just stop at ending defense relations with France. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share.